Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here. It's wonderful to be with you on this absolutely glorious early summer day. And I want to start a summer conversation by actually sharing with you a Christmas present. And this is a Christmas present that I received from a very dear friend of mine, the journalist Quinn Norden. And Quinn, for 2012, after the most recent American elections, made a set of these prints and sent them out to many of her friends. And when we received these prints, we immediately knew what she was referring to, but you're not going to know what she was referring to, so I'll try to explain. Quinn had published an essay at the end of 2012 with the very provocative title, which was "Don't Vote." And this was an essay expressing her frustrations with what it meant to be an activist, what it meant to be someone who was very political in the United States at that particular moment. Because the United States is going through a very rough moment as far as civics are concerned. We have a Congress that isn't passing legislation. We have two parties in power that don't speak to one another, that don't compromise. It's been the least productive government in a very long time. The system is flooded with money. The people who are in power are in no danger of losing their jobs because the entire system is rigged by those in power so they never get voted out. So if you're someone who's working on an issue like inequality or racism or some of the deep structural problems, it's very hard to find faith in what's going on within the system. And so Quinn wrote this very passionate essay where she said, I've decided I'm on strike. I'm not voting until you can demonstrate to me that my vote is actually going to mean something, that voting is actually going to be a way that I can make change on the issues that I care about. And the brick is particularly significant because it's making fun of a sticker. This is a sticker that you get anytime you show up at elections in the US, and you're supposed to put it on your coat so you can prove to everybody that you voted. It's sort of like when you go to church on Ash Wednesday and they put the ash on your forehead. This is your way of proving that you've gone to the church of democracy. You've done your duty, you're a good citizen. And by putting it on a brick, Quinn is essentially saying, not only am I rejecting that, but I'm saying that maybe your vote should be a protest. Maybe your vote should be throwing a brick instead of showing up in the voting box. Now, this is a cartoon. I don't think she's actually encouraging us to stand up and riot, but it's a really nice way to point out the tension, which is that if you keep supporting a system that you know is broken, to some extent you are complicit in the continuation of that system. Now, Quinn sent this out right after she spent a year covering the Occupy movement, not as a member of Occupy, but someone who was in Occupy and giving it the attention and the respect and the careful reporting that it deserved as a way to show clear evidence of how systems are not working and how people are looking for ways to change them. So I took this Christmas gift and I pinned it over my desk, and it's been sitting there for 3 years now. And the reason it's been there is, for me, it represents this tension that I'm trying to figure out. Because I don't have a lot of faith at this point in the ability to make real systemic change through elections. And unfortunately, I also have real concerns about the ability of public movements to go out and make real change. So when I look at this brick, this is a challenge to me. What's the way forward at this moment today for someone who wants to make really big change in the world? So let me first explain to you why I'm not enormously confident about the ability to make change for elections. For one thing, in my country at least, I'm absolutely not alone. We just had the worst voter turnout in our most recent election in American history. It's gone down steadily every single year. It's always a little better during a presidential election. During those off-cycle elections, it gets worse and worse. This is the worst we've seen in 72 years. Now, the good news is that we're not entirely alone, because you guys in Europe are seeing many of the same trends. You've just had the lowest turnout for a European parliamentary election. And in fact, that turnout has been steadily dropping since 1979 to the present. And your national elections always do better than the European parliamentary elections, but they're dropping too. Across the board, we are seeing fewer and fewer young people in particular who are showing up and going to the voting booth. They don't particularly care about getting that sticker or their ash on the forehead. They don't necessarily see this as an essential part of what they can do. And people go out and blame young people for their failure to participate. They basically say, look, this is a generation that is so lazy, so distracted, paying so much time on their mobile phones, paying so much time on social networks, they don't pay attention to politics, they don't care about politics, they're not engaged with politics. But that's clearly not the case. If you look at the people who are going out into the streets, if you look at the people who are going out and making protests around the world, you can say a lot of things about these people, but you cannot call them lazy. These are people who are looking for different ways to go out and make change in the world. What's interesting about this is that we're seeing, in what you might call a golden age of protest, very different levels of success for different protests. In my country, we've just had a wave of protests, most recently in the city of Baltimore, where a young man named Freddie Gray, who was arrested by the police, was damaged so badly while in police custody that he later died. And when it became clear that he had died in police custody, people took to the streets, not just in Baltimore, but in Boston and New York, around the country. And within a week of his death, people got what they wanted. They actually had 6 officers arrested and charged in one case with murder. Now, this is a huge shift in the United States, where 101 unarmed black people were killed by police last year. And in almost no cases did you see an officer getting arrested. But there's now a protest movement that's capable of reacting very, very quickly to these atrocious circumstances and actually finding a path towards justice. And in fact, we've seen protest work with limited degrees of effect on much, much larger scale issues. 2011, in many ways, was sort of the high water mark for protest globally. We saw the Arab Spring begin to unfold in Tunisia in late 2010. We saw Egypt in 2011. We saw a wave of revolution spread throughout the region. But it's been a really mixed bag. We got a democracy in Tunisia. We also got 3 civil wars in Yemen, in Syria, and in Libya. We got incredible, vicious government crackdown in Bahrain. And what we've got in Egypt isn't clear even now, where you had an elected government toppled by a military government. We're learning that protests are very, very good at counterpower. They're really good at ousting surprised and unaware governments. But protests have a much harder time actually building governments than toppling them. And even though it's much easier philosophically to get very excited about protests in a monarchy or in a closed society, what started happening in 2011 was this same idea, this same revolutionary impulse to change the whole system by going out into the street. This continued, and it continued in North America and in South America and in Europe. People picked up the spirit of the Arab Spring, but they turned it into an anti-politics movement, a movement of people essentially saying, we may live in a democracy, but our system is so broken that we have to find a way to throw that system as a whole out. So in Spain, we saw the Indignados movement. We saw young people in particular come into the streets starting on May 15 in 2011, protesting austerity policies, protesting lack of opportunity for young people. People felt like Spain was being run by a wealthy elite for their benefit, not necessarily for ordinary citizens. And the movements lasted for almost a year before they turned into a political party, Podemos. And this is where things get tricky, because Podemos very quickly ended up the second largest political party in Spain, the second most members, within a week of being founded. But during the first election cycle, they only got 8% of the vote. There was something about taking a street movement and trying to bring it into the political sphere that didn't work very well. Occupy started shortly after, September 17, 2011, with Occupy Wall Street in Zuccotti Park. We remember people going into the streets to protest inequality, financial corruption, a broken banking industry, housing college debt burdens in the United States. Some amazing successes on a local level. Local versions of Occupy often did a really good job of keeping people from losing their homes. And across the country, you have far more dialogue in the US about inequality than you had 4 years ago. Across the world, Occupy became a model that people have used for protests like Occupy Hong Kong. But even the most ardent supporters of Occupy will tell you that it probably has not led to the sort of major structural changes that we hope to see in American society. It got a lot of attention, it got a lot of energy, and it didn't convert into a movement that was able to govern. Here's a couple of reasons why some smart people worry about what the limits of protests may be. This is Zeynep Tufekci. She's an anthropologist. She goes out and studies protests, hence the nifty helmet. The helmet, by the way, is for the thrown tear gas canisters. You don't want to get hit with them. Zeynep just did a brilliant field study on what happened with the Gezi Park protests, which were amazingly powerful. They brought 3.5 million Turks out into the streets in 90 different cities from May to August of 2013. And it was an incredibly diverse set of protesters. You had everybody from ultranationalists to gay rights activists showing up at the same time. But what's interesting is the protests were really brief. They were huge, they brought a ton of people out, but then they went away very, very quickly. And in fact, the main demand of those protests, which was to eliminate Erdogan, they got completely the opposite. In fact, Erdogan ran for president and won without even a runoff. So they got the opposite of what they were looking for. And Zeynep says that what's happening is that it's getting so much easier these days to build protests. We go on Facebook, we go on Twitter, we live stream it on Ustream or on Periscope. We have all this ability to draw people out and bring them to be part of our movement. What we don't have is any of the hard work we used to have to do trying to get those people to settle their differences before they go into the streets together. So the motto for the Gezi protests, it actually comes from a Rumi poem, and it's the phrase, "Send a gel," you, too, you come. And that's what the protests were about. No matter who you are, no matter what you believe in, come join us in the streets. We'll find a way to be opposed together. But that's not a very strong movement. That's a very brittle movement. And when people work to shut that movement down, or when people work to try to figure out how do we turn this movement into politics, how do we try to engage with the system, we have a very, very hard time making it work. Zeynep worries that what we're about to see is an age of protests that are bigger but weaker than ever before. And she worries that people like Erdogan know exactly how weak these big movements can be. That leaders used to be afraid of 50,000 people in the streets because that meant huge amounts of organizing behind the scenes. Now even 1 million people in the streets doesn't necessarily scare a government because they know how quickly it can come together. Now if that's not depressing, this is depressing. Ivan Krastev is a leading Bulgarian political scientist, and he's also been studying this wave of protests after 2011. And his feeling about this is that even if a movement like the Indignados, even if they go out and topple the government, even if they oust people in power, they're still not going to get what they want. And his theory about this is that governments are so much weaker than we really think they are. We think that the people that we voted into power have the power to change everything. But in fact, a lot of what's happening right now between nations is not really governed by the people that we elect. It's governed by financial markets. And he gives this example. When Berlusconi got kicked out of office in Italy, it wasn't a popular movement that finally got rid of Silvio. It was the bond market. We got to the point where Italy simply couldn't afford to borrow money anymore. And so the people didn't vote Berlusconi out of office. The bankers voted Berlusconi out of office. And at a certain point, he had to go because there was no way to keep the country going. And you may be happy that Berlusconi is gone. I think a lot of people are. But what's actually happening, Krashev believes, is that politics has been reduced to the art of adjusting to the imperatives of the market. That these people who we feel like we can influence either in the voting booth or by taking to the streets, these are not the real people in power. And we're going to have a test of this in Greece to see whether Syriza, a movement from the left, a real opposition political movement, can actually govern that country, or whether they get voted out of power again by the market. So this is pretty chilling. If you have people who are frustrated and disengaging from politics as usual, from showing up at the ballot box and trying to make change that way, and you're starting to have these smart people saying, look, it may not be as easy as we hope to make change by going and taking to the streets. Well, what do we do next? We need a third way. We need some way of engaging in politics, in civic life, in public life that isn't as slow and indirect as representative democracy, that isn't both as direct and as fragile as going into the streets. And so for many of us in this room, the third way for the last 20 years has been the hope that we're somehow going to go online, we're somehow going to find a digital approach to these issues that allows us to find a third way. So I've been working on this and thinking about this for a long time. I am lucky enough to have been working on internet companies for more than 20 years, working with one of the very first internet companies that worked on this idea of social media and user-generated content. And I can tell you that when we go back into the 1990s, a lot of the people who were doing this work, we weren't doing it because there was an enormous amount of money, because in the early 1990s, there was no money at all. We were doing it because we thought that this was an incredible shortcut to trying to build a better world. We believed a lot of things about what was going to be different because of the internet. For one thing, we believed that it wouldn't be possible for a single powerful company to control markets anymore, because it was so easy for people to start new businesses. You weren't going to have a single firm that simply dominated and controlled every aspect of our life. No one would be able to build something as big as a search engine that had no rival, or a social network that somehow dominated the entire networking scene. It just simply couldn't be possible. We believed that the internet shouldn't be able to be censored. In fact, that the internet was going to route around censorship, that it was going to be the ultimate space for freedom of speech, and that, as President Clinton said at one point, censoring the internet is like nailing gelatin to the wall. It simply can't be done. People are going to find their way around it. We believed that the internet was going to let people interact with one another in a way that was completely different. You weren't going to care whether you were male or female. You weren't going to care whether you were black or white. It wouldn't matter what nation you were from. All that would really matter is who you were and what your ideas were. And of course, no one would actually care about your identity to try to sell you things. And of course, this would be a much more open and fair space and much safer for people like women and marginalized groups to have conversations. How are we doing on these things so far? We believed that this was a space that the governments didn't care about, that they weren't going to bother paying attention to. And even if they were, that the internet was so vast that it just wasn't going to be possible to monitor all of it, and that the companies that we were using to communicate in this space were going to protect our privacy, and that even if we had something really, really careful that we had to get out there, we had unbreakable encryption, and that no one was going to pay attention and be able to read what we had to say. In other words, we believed a lot of really dumb shit. Now, this may have been really brave, ambitious. A lot of this was really brave, ambitious, and hopeful, but ultimately really dumb stuff. We didn't know what we know now, which is that the internet doesn't magically make everything better. It doesn't magically turn itself into a freer and fairer and more inclusive space. In fact, you can look at this right now where you have Sir Tim Berners-Lee leading a campaign for the web we want. 25 years after he invented the World Wide Web, he's now asking this question, what's the web we want? And the web we want is very, very different from the web we have. It's more inclusive, it's more fair, it's more open to more parts of the world. So for all of these disappointments that we've been dealing with for the last 25 years, I want to argue that maybe the biggest disappointment is how the internet has affected how we govern. Many of us 20 years ago believed that what was going to happen is that the internet was going to open up politics to a much wider range of people. It wasn't necessarily going to be the people who stood up and gave great speeches. It might be people who had great ideas, could figure out how to share them online. I start thinking about how groups like the Pirate Party tried to bring new people into politics with very limited success. But the internet may be possible to bring some really interesting figures. Talking with my friend Malte Spitz, probably my favorite German politician, it's only in the age of the internet that I could imagine him getting elected to office. But for the most part, what's happened is that actual politicians, existing parties, have figured out how to use these structures to raise money, to raise their profile. It's a lot of the same people. They've just figured out how to use these new tools. We really hoped that what the internet would do is increase transparency. And in fact, it has. We've seen wonderful efforts to try to get open government data, and in some cases even secrets and leaks out there. But it turns out that the data itself is not enough. Simply having data on what the government is doing doesn't necessarily change what governments are doing. We need people to analyze, we need people to investigate, we need journalists, we need storytellers, we need data visualization people. We need a whole army of people to try to take even the most compelling secret information and actually have it turn into something that we can use to change the world. And we really hoped that we would start seeing direct participation in legislation. We would see people actually getting together, writing legislation online. We've had very limited versions of this. We've had the Marco Civil de Internet in Brazil, a remarkable piece of crowdsourced legislation. The people behind it, including Ronaldo Lemos at the Institute of Technology and Society in Rio, are putting forth a platform that are going to let people work together and write legislation. But this is a tiny, tiny minority of what's happened so far. It's been a rounding error. And if you ask people what went wrong, what did we get wrong 20 years ago when we said that the internet was going to change politics, there's at least two answers. One answer comes from my friend Miha Sifry. Miha put out a very, very good book called The Big Disconnect, Why the Internet Hasn't Transformed Politics Yet. And it's a very brave book because he's saying much of what I'm saying here, and Miha is neck deep in politics, so it's very, very hard for him to admit that so far the internet hasn't been the transformation that we've wanted. But what Miha believes is that we just don't have the tools yet. That the internet right now is mostly a broadcast medium. That when you sign up for a party or you sign up to follow a politician, they simply advertise to you online rather than giving you a back channel to tell them what you want and what you believe. And that we haven't solved the problem of deliberation at scale. We don't yet have a tool that lets us get together and have a conversation and say, how should we compromise, how should we work together and solve this issue? Miha thinks that the solution is things like Democracy OS, which is this remarkable new platform of software built by Argentina's Net Party, led by Pia Mancini, which is letting people say, okay, if you elect me, I'm going to make it possible for you to give feedback on all of my decisions. We're going to write legislation together. Let's find a way to work together so that I, as your representative in Parliament, am doing a better job and you feel like you have a voice. I think these efforts are really laudable, I think they're fantastic, and I think they're way, way too small. Because I don't think we've ever taken on the real problem. And this is the real problem. We are living in an age where many, many people are mistrustful, not just of the government, but of all sorts of institutions. This is a graph of public trust in government in the United States from the 1960s to the present. You'll see that it peaks up there in 1964, with 77% of Americans saying that they believe the government will do the right thing all or most of the time. And it's dropped steadily down into the 1980s. It's dropped even lower since then. It's now down around 24 points. Now, for me, I'm born in 1973. I'm 42 years old. In my entire lifetime, there has been one single moment where 50% of my fellow citizens trusted the government. And it was at that precise moment that George W. Bush led us into a horrible and stupid war in Iraq. The whole rest of the time, we have been in a position of not trusting what the government has to say. And it's not just the government. If you ask Americans, they'll tell you, we don't trust the government, we don't trust banks, we don't trust corporations, we don't trust the press, we don't trust NGOs. The one institution we seem to still trust is the military, which frankly scares the crap out of me because that's what happened in Egypt, where you had a situation where people lost faith in every single institution other than the one with the guns. Now, before you think this is Americans, we know they're uniquely screwed up, let me point to some of this work being done by our friends over at Edelman. Edelman has been trying to figure out what's the status of trust in Europe. And according to their survey, you guys have worse problems than we do. In fact, they argue that when they ask people, they ask 100 citizens in 33 nations how much they trust the government, NGOs, business, and the media. They found, first of all, that trust is at an all-time low, that Germany, Italy, Poland, Spain, Sweden, and Ireland all have lower levels of trust than we have over in the United States. And I've been going around and I've been talking to friends about this, and they've been pointing to recent events, Lügenpresse, this debate about whether the German press is actually able to be fair and objective. For me, this is part of this same phenomenon. This is this moment of a very high baseline level of skepticism in any large institution of any sort. And let me go further and say, I don't think this is just an attitude. I actually think a lot of this skepticism, a lot of the time, is highly justified. I don't have a full explanation for why we're going through this moment of mistrust, but there's a lot of possible reasons. One of the ones that Thomas Piketty has been pointing out is that we're going through another wave of inequality. After going through a period where society was getting closer, society was getting more equal, we were getting better distribution of wealth, we're now at a position where elites are pulling away from ordinary people. And if you're in a system where you feel like you have less and less money and less power, it makes perfect sense that you would be mistrustful of that system. It's possible that transparency, this incredible move we've had with the internet to saying, let's just publish everything, let's put as much information out there as we can, that one of the downsides of transparency is that we see all the shortcomings and all the weaknesses of these institutions. Sometimes we see massive, systemic, catastrophic weakness, as we do with the banking system in 2007, 2008. Sometimes we see minor weakness, the sort of weakness that we should be able to forgive and move on beyond, but we end up building these cycles of mistrust where we punish again and again and again for these missteps. I think professionalization has a lot to do with this. In the US, it's gotten to the point where you simply can't run for office unless you're a multimillionaire. But even in Europe, you've seen a real professionalization of the political class. You have a real difference between many of the people who are representing you in parliament and ordinary citizens. And that notion of politics being something that professionals do rather than something that everyone does is another way to create this sort of mistrust. And as Quinn was saying at the beginning of this, when you feel powerless, when you feel like there is no good way that you as an individual can make a change in your society, that's an incredible impetus to feel mistrustful of all of these different institutions. Now, the problem with mistrust is that mistrust is incredibly corrosive. If you feel like you can't trust a bank, you're not going to put your money in it. And at a certain point, the bank doesn't have any money and it can't lend any money. If you don't trust the government, you're less likely to pay your taxes. And if you don't pay your taxes, the government is bound to be ineffective because it actually can't figure out anything to do. And so when people talk about mistrust, they always talk about it as something to fix. They talk about it as something that if we would just sort of get together, maybe we would learn a little bit more about it, maybe we would understand the legislature a little bit better, and suddenly we'll feel better about it, and we'll be a warmer, trusting, friendlier society, and we'll all get along better. And I just stopped buying it. I don't think it's happening. I think we have at least 2 generations of people my age and younger, for whom mistrust is the default state. We start mistrusting until we're proven otherwise. And you have to continually demonstrate that some of these institutions are something that we should give our trust to. And so here's the truly crazy idea I want to put forward in this talk. I think we have to find a way to take this mistrust, to take this baseline state of how many of us are in society, and try to figure out how you would turn this into an asset. How do we turn mistrust into the fuel that lets us transform the world that we live in today? I've got a couple ideas for how we might do this. I'm watching people who no longer have a lot of faith in their ability to make change at the ballot box look for other ways to make change. My guide to this is Larry Lessig's book, Code. And for those of you who've read the book, you may remember Lessig says, look, we think that what regulates the world is law. We think that if we want to make a change, we have to pass a law and make something legal or illegal. But actually, we change the world in a lot of different ways. We make changes through code, which makes it easy or hard to do certain things. We make changes through markets, which make it expensive or cheap to do certain things. We change through norms, where we make it socially popular or taboo to do certain things. So for people who are looking at the world and saying, I don't feel like I have a lot of ability to make change with law, you have the possibility of change through code. I'd really love to see European governments find out some way to stand up for personal privacy and put real consequences for the companies and for the governments that have violated our trust in the revelations that have come out in the wake of Snowden. I know better than to even say that I would like my government to make those changes, because it's not going to happen. And so I don't trust these guys very much to do it. But I've got an enormous amount of faith in some of the people who are trying to make these changes in code. It's not going to happen in US Congress. But maybe it's going to happen through Tor, or through Whisper Systems, or the Guardian Project, or Mailpile, or Mailvelope, or all these people trying to figure out how we can make security, cryptography, privacy the default for our personal communications as an essential precursor to us to live in a democratic society. I really wish we would see UN organizations take a firm lead towards a global carbon tax so we can do something about global warming. I don't know that it's going to happen. But I'm fascinated by companies like Tesla that are going into the marketplace and saying, yeah, right now it's a $100,000 electric car, but wait until it's a $20,000 electric car. And wait until this is the vehicle that everybody wants to have, and we move to a system where we're taking one of the major sources of emissions and moving instead towards solar power. We'd love to see more people taking Germany's lead around something like solar power and making it affordable within the marketplace, so that if we can't achieve that in international institutions, we can achieve it through markets. And it turns out that norms within this are probably the most powerful way we know how to make change. A lot of the problems that we're facing in my country right now are problems of racism. And we have laws against it. There are laws against shooting unarmed black men. That isn't the problem. It's not passing more laws. It's changing hearts and minds. It's changing it so that for most people, when they encounter a young African-American man, their response is not fear, which is what's leading to the violence. And so a campaign like Black Lives Matter is going after norms. It's getting people to see these larger problems and trying to make changes in how we treat each other. So this is one path to change when you don't trust the institutions. It's to try to figure out a whole other way to make change within different systems. Here's another way that people are doing it. I call this idea ManaToriel Citizenship. It's an idea that basically says, we aren't doing our job if all we're doing is showing up to vote every couple of years. Our job is to be an engaged and skeptical critic of governments every day, looking at what they're providing and asking the question, are we getting what we've been promised, and are we getting what we need? Here's a project by my friend Luigi Reggi, works for the Italian government, charged with a really interesting open data project, built a beautiful, beautiful open data tool, which is an index of every project funded by EU cohesion funds within Italy. If you're in Italy, you can look up exactly where those funds have gone on, what's been built in your neighborhood, how's it going, and nobody uses the tool. And so Luigi did all of this work to build this tool, and he started talking to his friends, and he would say, well, are you using the tool? No, I'm not using the tool. Well, what do you think about the EU? Oh, the EU is a terrible idea. We get nothing out of it. So he looked at this and said, look, clearly just transparency is not going to solve this problem. Clearly, I've got to do something else. And so he started leading small teams of people to go knock on the door of an EU-funded project and audit it. Show up and say, what are you doing? How's it going? What did you promise you were going to do with the money? Have you done it? Has it gone well? And what's crazy is that this has become a popular weekend activity. He's calling this the Monathon. It builds on the hackathon. Hackathons are great if you know how to hack, if you know how to build things. Maybe you can build something very quickly. But you know what? Everybody knows how to monitor. And we can all go out and sort of ask these questions. And in fact, this works so well that this is now being used at the high school level. When you take high school civics in parts of Italy, instead of sitting there and reading textbooks about how government works, you go out and ask hard questions about whether the government is doing the work that you need it to be doing for you. I stole a lot of these ideas. I've taken them to a couple of projects that we're working on in Brazil. We're doing a lot of work right now in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And we're doing it because the mayor of Sao Paulo did something very, very unusual. He said, look, I'm going to promise you 100 concrete promises over the course of 4 years. And these are concrete things like, I'm going to put in 400 kilometers of bike lanes. I'm going to put in 17,000 street lamps. And they're published in a 300-page book so that you can hold him to it. But of course, no one built a system to actually let citizens go and monitor these problems. So we did. So we built a system called Promise Tracker, which lets people get together in their neighborhood and say, what do you care about? What are the local issues that you care about that you want to fix? From a smartphone, you can make a survey. The survey can take GPS readings, it can take photos, it can take videos. It puts together a crowd map, a way of sort of visualizing this information. So you say to a group of young parents, what do you care about? And they say, we care about parks. We want to make sure that the kids have a place to play. Great. 10 minutes, they design a survey, they hand it out to their friends. You have 100 people with phones who can go out and start building a map of how parts are working or not working in Sao Paulo. And once you have that map, you can do some interesting things. You can go to the mayor and say, you promised us parks. Where are our parks? You can go to the press and say, look, you didn't report on this issue that we really care about, but we did. Maybe you can work with us and actually publish the information that we have. Or you can take these maps and you can try to figure out how to solve it yourself. Are there problems that we can get together as a community and solve? We launched this in Sao Paulo 3 weeks ago. It's been so popular that my staff in Sao Paulo has now been invited to 9 other cities around the country just in the last 3 weeks. People are desperate for some way to come in and feel like they can actually have an impact, that they can actually make a change. One of the things, by the way, that's really interesting about this is that when you start monitoring government systems, you start from this position of opposition. You start from thinking, I really hate this, we're not getting what we want. And then you go out in the community and you take a close look, and you discover a lot of the time that actually you are. You're getting more than you think. And it ends up actually changing your relationship with the people who are providing you government services. For me, in many ways, the most ambitious idea in all of this is this ambition that says, you know what? Institutions inherently are not to be trusted. I don't care whether I'm building them, I don't care whether I'm monitoring them, I simply don't think that any large structure is the way that we should do things. And this is one of the things that the net community has gotten the most passionate about. 10 years ago, I remember being in Berlin when Freifunk was trying to build a citywide wireless network. And we started at CCC, and we started roaming in all directions over the city to see if we could get the mesh to span the whole city. 10 years later, mesh is starting to look like a very realistic way of dealing with some connectivity problems. And it's a way of doing it that doesn't have a single ISP or a single point of failure. These sorts of systems are incredibly hard to engineer. They're incredibly hard to build, but they're a wonderful aspiration because they take us out of some of these problems, of someone in the center of the network, someone who we're going to end up at some point lobbying or protesting or voting in and out of power. If we can find a way to build architectures that resist centralization, we have something really interesting. And with Bitcoin, we now have this really interesting challenge that something radically decentralized could also be something that is firmly in the realm of something that we think that's in the space of the government. Now, we've got huge problems with this. When we build these decentralized alternatives, we need them to work as well as the institutions that we have. We need them to be as reliable, we need them to be as believable while they're decentralized. There are real problems with ManaToriel citizenship. All you can do is try to hold someone to their promises. You can't necessarily try to make them take on something new, take on something more ambitious. When you're working on these new systems, there's the danger that you become the new institution that no one trusts and that everyone's fighting against. Our friends at Google 10 years ago thought that they were the insurgents. They thought that they were trying to topple the dominant power, and now for many of them, they are the dominant power that we want to try to find a way to challenge. But what I think these alternatives all have in common is they start pointing to a third way. And it's a third way that instead of letting us get paralyzed by mistrust, and letting mistrust say, you know what, I'm going to give up, I'm going to sit on the sidelines, I'm not going to do anything with this anymore. These are ways to use mistrust to come together and become more powerful. This is the middle path between the ballot box and the brick. It's taking this dangerous and corrosive mistrust that we now face, and it's using it to build the institutions we deserve. And that's the challenge of our generation. It's the challenge to build a better world than the one that we inherited, and one that's fairer, more just, more beautiful, and more worthy of our trust. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ethan. That is exactly why we've been wanting you here very badly for the last years, and I'm so glad that you came today. I think we have a couple of minutes. If you're willing, then we can take a couple of questions, maybe
absolutely.
2 or 3. Would you like to give me a sign of hands? I'll come down and meet you with a microphone. I saw you raise your hand. The others have to wave higher.
Instead of saying don't vote, why don't you just form a new party?
So keep in mind, my whole talk was trying to reject don't vote and also was trying to reject the protest. But the problem with a new party is if you're in a position where you're mistrustful of institutions in general, it's very hard to mobilize people around founding that new party. I think part of what's going on is not just dissatisfaction with the existing parties, it's often dissatisfaction with the party system as a whole and what those parties are capable of and not capable of. And I think when you look at someone like Khrushchev, who I was talking about there, he was arguing that it's not just that the wrong people are in power, but even if you have the right people in power, they're not necessarily able to make the really big, dramatic changes that we need. So I think found another party is absolutely one alternative, but I'm looking at what I'm thinking of as that third path of other ways to try to make change in the world that are outside of that system.
We have another 2 questions over here.
Hi, it's Mushan. I wanted to ask, can you show us an example where a distributed or decentralized power structure has managed to, rather than evade counterpower, actually gather power in itself, something that is quite needed if we need governance?
So I think it's much harder to find the examples in politics. I think it's a lot easier to find the examples in other fields. I think we've watched highly centralized ways of organizing companies and knowledge get toppled by the open source system. I think watching Microsoft, have sort of Linux come in and essentially shake the foundations is the parallel that some are looking for in many ways. We've seen sometimes in communities successful devolution of power, but it seems very, very hard to have this work solely within traditional political circumstances. And I don't know that that's exactly the first target we go for, but I think looking for ways where highly devolved decentralized power has come into play and then building on top of it, I think is a great way to go. And that's where I think technologies like the blockchain, where people are really working from the ground up to say, this does not work well in a centralized fashion, I think that's a very intriguing way to go.
I have a question in terms of mistrust. You're promoting mistrust. But the way you're promoting mistrust means that you have trust in mistrust. And this mistrust can be abused by those who are in power. Can you say something about this?
So I want to be clear, I don't think I'm promoting mistrust. I think what I'm doing is recognizing mistrust. And I'm arguing that mistrust is a critical part of our current moment in time. And what I'm suggesting is that mistrust is something that we have to acknowledge, recognize, and then try to figure out how to channel. And my hope is that many of the methods that I'm talking about help reduce mistrust. If you go out and start monitoring your government and discovering that in many cases the government is doing well, that lowers the level of mistrust. If you end up building your own institution and it sticks better to your values and your principles than other institutions out there, that lowers levels of mistrust. But there is no doubt that there are other people recognizing the power of mistrust and trying to figure out how to use it towards their own ends. I look at what RT is doing in debates about the Ukraine, and I think the Russian government may understand mistrust better than any other force on the planet right now, and is trying to figure out how to sort of turn the media into a space where no one trusts anything at all. It's not that I'm pro-mistrust, it's that I'm pro-trying to figure out what we do with it and how to move it in a constructive way. Thanks so much. Great.
Hello. Okay. I used to work for diaspora and some open source social networks, and basically none of them got popular. And some people are claiming that they haven't got popular because there was no way of monetizing them. For example, Bitcoin, which got popular, for me, the main achievement of Bitcoin is blockchain. It made blockchain able to monetize because you could make money just mining Bitcoins. And my question is, shouldn't we look for ways to monetize decentralized infrastructure? And if so, where is the point that we should stop, not to become the next giant and not to make ourselves irreplaceable?
So I think building sustainable projects through whatever way you do it is a critical factor in all of this. And I think one of the things that makes it very difficult to replace existing institutions with new, more open, more fair, more participatory ones is that they're often very, very difficult to support. I agree with you that part of what's exciting is that in Bitcoin you have something that's both philosophically very interesting and also capable of a certain amount of self-sustaining and self-support. But I don't think those can be the only systems we build. There are a lot of issues that are capable of being fueled really just by our energy. Not everything has to turn into a billion-dollar, venture capital funded project. If what you really need is a way for a set of people to get together and solve a problem, and you have people who want to make change by making code, we need to do a much better job of matching up people who care about the change more than they care about building an enormous business with the communities who want to work with them on trying to figure out how we take on these issues. So I think they're both important factors. I don't think they're inherently linked.
And one more here.
Great.
Hi. So one question, you mentioned mostly private initiatives when you talked about monitoring, privacy, security, etc. But there are also a lot of companies who are trying to protect our privacy and security, etc. But they are also on the financial side, right? So how do they have to behave to be successful in this game between trust and mistrust?
Yeah. So I think one of the interesting things, when we start talking about mistrust, when we start talking about monitoring, what we're really talking about is not just government institutions, it's all different sorts of institutions. And one of these questions becomes, how do you create that culture even within a company? What would it mean to build a company where mistrust was actually seen as an asset and something that could be constructive for how the business worked and moved forward? What would it mean to have a process that wasn't just transparent, but was also to one extent or another confrontational? And this is very different from the way we work it now, right? Right now, the major way that we look for trust in corporations is we build brand, trust us, and we occasionally respond to a whistleblower who basically exits the system saying, I'm going to show you what's wrong. It's very interesting to me to think about what would you do within a corporation in the same way that the city of Sao Paulo is basically inviting people in to say, monitor our practices, see what's going on, see if it's working well, help us try to figure out how to get it better. It's not going to work for everything. I understand that there's aspects of financial transactions that we can't sort of open up in that fashion. But it's a very, very different paradigm from how businesses work today. And for me, it's a provocative idea of thinking about what would it mean to let our employees and let our customers take on that relationship and very aggressively monitor what we're doing well and what we're doing poorly. And I think that's something that actually would lead to a very different change in trust around these institutions.
The gentleman in the back.
Hello, good morning. My name is Roberto Suarez. I'm the head of research of the European Broadcasting Union, the professional association of public service media in Europe. And we have been doing some research on trust, and following the figures delivered by the Eurobarometer last year, what we found is that Europeans trust, first of all, radio, secondly, TV, they don't trust the press, they don't trust the internet, and what they trust the least is social networks. So my question is, in your talk you have been talking about the internet and all the new tools, but do you think, from your perspective and your American perspective, that traditional media, do they still have a role to play in building trust, or are they part of this broken system you're talking about?
So you get different figures depending on how you ask these questions. If you ask the question, do you believe what you read that's randomly circulating on the internet versus do you believe what's coming out from a national broadcaster, the national broadcaster comes out higher. But if you ask people what they trust, people will tell you that they trust their friends, and that information delivered by the people who's closest to them ends up becoming the highest in trust systems all over the time. And so I do think that in many cases, the ability of people to get together and self-organize with their communities ends up being significantly more trusted than even a national broadcaster. And as you're seeing in Germany, as we've seen in the UK, there have been very interesting moments where national broadcasters have also felt eroding trust, even if that trust is, and in many cases justifiably, some of the higher trust within the ecosystem. Certainly within the US, we actually have fairly high trust in our national radio broadcaster, in some of our better newspapers, but it's still an evolving environment. And what I think is happening to those national broadcasters is less and less can they be guaranteed that trust, and less can they guarantee that power that they get to set the agenda and dominate the conversation. And so I think it's a changing environment, even for the national broadcasters. I was talking with a friend about this yesterday and talking about what does it mean to build news for a world of mistrust. And I think what it means is that we don't just report, but we also report on why we believe what we believe and how we know it and how we've tried to verify it. And I see some of the best news organizations moving towards this and really putting forward how they're building that news and how they're trying to build trust in it. And I think for national broadcasters and for everybody else, I think starting from this assumption that the audience doesn't trust you and that part of what you have to do is explain why you believe and why you trust what you're saying, I think that's a critical part of the equation.
So you gave the example of the city of Sao Paulo bringing people in and asking them to help do their job better. And the government in Pakistan is doing something similar where we have the citizens feedback model where the government proactively asks for feedback and tries to engage the citizenry in good governance. And I was telling this about the system to somebody and they said, isn't this the government trying to legitimize themselves? And so there's such distrust that even if the government is trying to open themselves up, people are like, no, maybe that this is just their way to show that they're doing something about it, but they're not. And so I'm wondering, as in, can people within the government do something better if they're trying to open themselves up, if they're trying to be more transparent, if they're trying to get feedback, what else can they do to regain the trust that they've lost over the past lots of years?
Because I was trying not to fill up the full hour, I was too quick in my Sao Paulo story. But in Sao Paulo, our partner is not actually the government. Our partner is a group called Rede Nossa Sao Paulo, which is an association of neighborhood organizations. And Rede Nossa Sao Paulo actually was instrumental in getting the mayor to make this commitment towards transparency. So what we have is essentially a situation where you've got a community committed to trying to figure out how they make sure they hold the government to their promises. What we actually call this, we call this liberal mistrust. Liberal democracies rely on a certain amount of mistrust. There's mistrust between the parliament and the executive and the judiciary, and that's how you have checks and balances. And what I'm interested in is, can we take that idea of constructive liberal mistrust and bring it out into the community? So I agree with you. I think having the government in the lead on it is probably not the right way to do it. I think civil society in the lead on it and government receptive is a much better way to do it. But I think what you're really pointing to is, for me, this sort of key issue. Even when the government is sort of showing up and saying, we want you to participate more, everyone sort of assumes that this is just another marketing ploy. This is a trap. At some point, we have to figure out, how do we actually get that input? How do we make it constructive? Because we know that that's a spiral. And it's a spiral that gets worse and worse and worse until we do find ourselves in a situation like Egypt where we say we reject it all and we've got to start from scratch.
Two more.
Hello, my name is Martin Schmidt from the Center of Contemporary History in Potsdam. You say we live in an age of mistrust, but now we are here in the city of Berlin, and Berlin was the center of a system of mistrust which was called the GDR. In the GDR, mistrust was in every single bit of personal relationship, in economics, in politics, everywhere. So how can you just say, just for a second, that we are now living in an age of mistrust, as the generation before us had to get over this and get over the wall to end the system of mistrust. So we are living in a society where you can stay here and say we are living in an age of mistrust, but you can trust that you can go home safely. I just am asking if today we are have a high standard where we are trusting in our lives and in a better future, but are just a little bit grumpy about the things, how it goes?
It's a very, very helpful point. Perhaps the answer should be I should be more nuanced in my statements in saying that in open democratic societies, I think we are at a much lower level of trust than we were as recently as 40 or 50 years ago. You're very right to point out that in this particular place, in this particular moment of time, there have certainly been points of higher mistrust. And when I'm talking about societies in which the response has been revolution, that tends to be a response that's a much more reasonable one in a fully closed society. That said, within open democratic societies, I am quite happy to make the argument that we are at a much lower level of trust than we were even 2 or 3 generations ago. And so I think it's always helpful as a historian to come in, find the counterexample, and particularly in this place at this time, you have an excellent counterexample. But I think my overall argument regarding the last 250 years of representative democracy in open societies, I think is perhaps a reasonably sound one. But maybe we can find a way to talk afterwards, and you can try to talk me out of that contention.
Hello. Yeah. Hello? I'm here. Hello.
Hello.
So, last question. Thank you very much for the question before. I would like to add to this. Actually, this prejudice, Lügenpresse, comes from a very particular group here in Germany. It's not like a common thing. And so I really think your talk was very interesting, but still I think it's from a very American perspective. And we here in Europe have a different situation and a different history, and a different intellectual history also. And so I'm wondering where you see the differences, actually. This would be my question, because I think there are a lot of different differences, and the mistrust here is, if there is some, it's completely different than from what problems you do have.
But part of what's helpful about showing up in different countries and trying to share ideas is that you find out whether they resonate locally or not. And I would not be surprised to find out that Germans either feel a very different history associated with mistrust, or that the idea that I'm putting forward simply doesn't apply. But that's the whole point of sort of coming here and trying to give a conversation. It would be very hard for me as an American scholar to give you a German talk. So it's helpful for me to get the feedback that these generalizations may be overgeneralized. I do want to push on this question of whether post-World War II, there is a sense that trust has been declining or increasing. I'm not speaking entirely without evidence. I am pointing to other people who think that this trend is going on. But I'm fine with hearing the response that this is a particularly American phenomenon and a particularly American problem. I don't know that it is, based on a lot of the other examples that I've been getting throughout the continent and in some countries that I know better. But I appreciate the pushback.
Thank you so much, Ethan.
Thanks very much.
Let's have another big round of applause, please.